Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to Keep Indiana Learning. My name is Tim Arnold, and I'm a digital learning coach with Keep Indiana Learning. And today I'm here with my fellow digital learning coaches, Brenny Nicole and Nicole Nelson, for the latest episode of our book study series, Keep Indiana Reading, the Shift to Student-Led Edition. Today our focus will be on Chapter 8 and Workflow Shift number 8, from Teacher Assessment to Self-Assessment. Before we dive in, let's do some introductions.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Tim, for the warm welcome, as always. I'm Brenny Nicole, the Assistant Director of EdTech in Bartholomew Consolidated Schools in Columbus, Indiana. I'm also a Keep Indiana Learning digital learning coach. I'm a member of the Indiana Connected Educators Board. I love this chapter. I felt like it was an area that I probably could have done better on as a teacher, and I love a lot of the strategies that they shared. So I'm very eager for our conversation today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Nicole Nelson. I'm from Lewis Cass Schools in my 24th year of education. And I am in my third year as the Technology Integration Specialist at Lewis Cass. And we are definitely glad to dive into this topic of self-assessment. I agree, Brenny, it wasn't something that I was super good at while I was in the classroom. But several of the examples, I was like, oh my gosh, that's so good. So I'm excited to talk about it too.
Great. And I'm Tim Arnold from Richmond Community Schools, a 34-year public school educator with 26 years in the classroom and 8 as a district e-learning specialist. Also a fellow Keep Indiana Learning digital learning coach and a HEC board member. I'm glad you guys reflected on that right off the bat about being able to use this, or wish we would have used this at a different time, because one of the conversations I often find myself having with teachers that I work with is, wow, we'd like our students to be a little more independent, or we'd like students to not be so dependent on us. And this chapter really speaks to that and gives some really good insight into that. I love the opening scene. Catelyn Tucker, one of the two authors, said it's called Death by a Thousand Ums. And she's talking about the first time that she watched a video of herself presenting. I think she was presenting at Q in California, which I think somebody on this panel was at recently, right? Okay. And so my question to you guys and to everybody in the audience is, who remembers the first recording that they made for their students? How many takes did you go through? You know, how many times did you watch it before you put it out to them? Were you nervous when you made it available to them? And did you ask for feedback afterwards? Because self-assessment is such a vital part of improvement for us and for our students alike. I remember mine like it was yesterday. I was teaching in a rural district, and about a third of my class was gone at the National FFA convention. And I had to find a way to get the information for class to them. And so I said, okay, this is it. I'm just going to do it. I'm going to record some of what we did in class. I'm going to make a video. I'm going to insert some slides, talk over the top of it, and send it off on their way. And that was the beginning of a whole new experience for me. But it was a little intimidating the first time.
I remember making one of my first ones when we had our first ever e-learning days in our district. And it wasn't actually because of snow. It was because of flooding that siphoned off part of our county. So none of the buses and the kids could leave that area and go elsewhere. And I was teaching 7th grade social studies. And I remember I was so anxious to make the video, which is hilarious because look, I'm on video now and I just do this all the time. But I was so nervous, and I was making my little screencastify with my slides and the voiceover like you, Tim. It was 1 a.m. because I kept redoing it, and I finally did it. And in the background of the video, I didn't realize it. My cat jumps over my shoulder. The kids, that was what they took out of the video. But I said the word so many times, and I was just so monotonous. And my kids definitely called me out on that, but I probably should have practiced a little bit more, and also maybe gotten some constructive, or at least modeled how to give constructive feedback to my students.
Yeah. listening to recordings of myself is like cringy. Like it makes me, I'm just like, you never sound the way that you think you sound when you're listening to yourself. So yeah, totally agree. And the pandemic sent us all into this idea of like becoming experts in video creation and screencasts and all of that. So
yeah, I'll just make a quick shout out to the product called Loom that helps me do a lot of my screen recording for teachers.
mm-hmm.
They have a feature in there where you can click it and it literally takes out all the ums.
Yeah,
it's so cool. So if you ever run across it, yeah, I wish that would have been there. What I remember from my first experience recording a lesson for students was that they would freeze my face in weird positions and take snapshots of it and then send it to each other. So we just kind of made it a contest after that to see who had the best one. And then we moved on. After they got through that, we were all good. But yeah, that's the whole self-assessment idea, that reflective process where students are using, a criteria to evaluate performance or figure out how to improve. The key thing that they said early in this chapter is that it should be formative and it should be focused on both current and future performance. I thought that was a really important point that they put out there.
Mm-hmm. I took away from, how they begin every chapter with like the research behind why is this strategy valuable or what does it help within the classroom. I highlighted and underlined all the parts that were speaking to helping students develop self-regulation skills. I obviously knew that like self-reflection is a good idea and valuable for students' development of themselves, but wouldn't have, I guess, necessarily put self-regulation skills together with that. But they talked about how it helps to develop the idea of adjusting to change and handling their frustrations and prolonging their attention spans, and just, building that awareness of themselves as learners, that they're more likely to ask questions and advocate for their needs when they have gone through that consistent practice of self-reflection.
Agreed. I liked the research part of this too. I mean, it was really pulling a lot of the direct quotes and verbiage that's used on the UDL guidelines, and I geek out over that stuff. I love it. I was like, oh, this is self-regulation, checkpoint, blah, 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 blah. And not that you need to memorize the checkpoints or anything, but I think I also appreciated they pointed out that this is something that has to be taught, and it has to be taught consistently. If you've ever had your students do any type of activity where they self-assess or they reflect on their learning, like I just remember my middle school students would be like, oh, I don't like doing this, because it's a skill that a lot of them really had not practiced with a whole lot or mastered. It's even something that I feel like I'm constantly growing and improving on, but it's so important. It really builds that resilience and you're willing to keep trying, that growth mindset piece. And it's a factor of the executive functioning parts of the brain. And really those parts of the brain aren't finished developing until you're in your mid to late 20s. So this is something we have to be super intentional about supporting our students on, according to the brain science piece, but also just so they have that coping skill. So when they have a setback or something, they feel more empowered to go in and keep learning.
Yeah. And it's always those pieces that are tough to implement because students resist so much in the beginning, and they fight you so much, and it's hard, right? That you're like, okay, oh, that was too much, let's give it some time before we tackle that again. But the more consistent that you are, the more repetitive that you are about it, obviously the better that everybody gets at it.
Absolutely. Well said by both of you. That piece, connecting self-regulation, was certainly new to me, connecting it to reflection, but that was an impressive bit of information there to take forward. So let's take a look at some of the strategies that they offered. One of the nice things about this book is they always offer some tangible strategies to take with you, often with great graphics involved. So strategy 1 talked about the use of exemplars, vocabulary, and success criteria for students as they're doing that self-assessment. So in terms of exemplars, we're talking about them looking for essential elements and strengths in the exemplars. Could be another student's work, could be another piece. Looking at the vocabulary, the specific vocabulary, think Frere model to learn the key vocabulary that you need, and then the success criteria. What does this look like when it's done well? And what I really loved about that is what the students were doing. They were analyzing, they were developing, and they were figuring out how to access those clear criteria in their own work.
Yeah, I loved that first section as well. And I teach a college class in the evenings and totally redid my final project. It's like the third time I taught this class. And I took this chapter as a source of inspiration for changing it because I don't feel like I was having them reflect as often as I should have. So instead of them just regurgitating, like, these are why UDL checkpoints are important, and here's a list of tech tools that I already know about that meet those guidelines, I wanted them to reflect and think about what it meant to them. So I actually had the students go and practice build a rubric, and we used Magic School to help us build the rubric itself, as well as a few exemplars I gave them. And they did do the whole like groaning, I don't want to reflect, I don't want to think about that part. But once they started doing it, the work they've made is amazing. And it was so much more meaningful to them because it was associated with something they had made, they had spent time on, and it was super exciting. I also loved on this chapter just talking about the power of exemplars. I know some people say that by showing like, oh, here's an example of what it could look like, I heard a teacher one time tell me that kills creativity. And I'm like, I don't agree with that. I think it gives a source of inspiration. Now, maybe you'll have some students who are like, oh, I have to make it exactly like that. And that's where you have those conversations where this is one way of doing this and why you provide flexible options. But I think that AI tools can really be so powerful in giving us exemplars for anything, especially if you're a first-year teacher and you don't have the previous year of student work to show the kids. And I love that they had pointed that out on this particular strategy.
Yeah, 100% agreed. I wrote down too, gosh, now with AI, we don't have to go back to previous year's students' work or have, spend hours creating an exemplar piece ourselves. Like you can, with AI, you can generate 2 or 3 exemplars in a matter of minutes. And this first strategy, I also liked the idea of them building the rubric together, using those exemplar pieces and what your success criteria would be, and then having, groups of students kind of collaborate on, well, okay, what does it look like to be a beginner in this criteria? What does it look like to be, the developing stage or proficiency? What does that look like? I thought that allowing students to have that conversation and kind of building that rubric together was a great idea.
If you want to see an example of what that conversation with students can look like, there's a teacher in my district she's a magician when it comes to this. She and her students work together to make rubrics for projects in her sophomore English class, and then her junior AP classes, I think, are the 2 that she teaches. And she actually has a webinar. It's on UDL IRN, which is the UDL Implementation and Research Network website. That's free, and she shares all of her resources. So I love reading things like this and then thinking like, what shape and form can this look like in the classroom? And she really does walk you through it. So just a shameless plug there. Her name's Kelly Culp. She's on Twitter. She has amazing stuff, but I would really recommend going there because it very closely ties in with this chapter of the book.
Very nice. Very nice. So strategy 2 talks about, the process or the action of reflecting. Reflective journaling, sketchnoting, podcasting, blogging, or I'll add vlogging to that. Quick shout out to Flip or Flipgrid for making this process so easy for students and teachers now. But to me, the key of this, no matter which of those that you want to employ, is giving the students agency over the format that they want to use to reflect and share what they've learned. I thought that was the key tenet of that part. So many great products, but give them the choice in this scenario.
Mm-hmm. I loved all the choices that they provided, different ways that you could have students reflecting, whether it was a vlog or it was a digital journal or just even paper, a paper journal. What I liked also were the idea of pairing that activity where you're not just kind of open-ended saying, reflect on your learning, reflect on your thinking. But they paired it with some guided questions like, what might you do differently in the future? What did you feel like was missing from your work? Or what strategies did you use that worked well? What aspects were strong? Or where did you see growth? were some of the questions that they suggested, but obviously just providing those questions to them so they have something kind of to go on.
We have another guest. I love it. I like the idea of the specific questions too, and then maybe even putting in a couple of sentence stems or sentence starters to help the students, especially if you have some students who are kind of struggling with this whole idea of reflecting, or if you have multilingual learners or students who just need that extra modeling and scaffolding before they do this. And the nice thing with those tools, especially Flip, as Tim had mentioned, is that they can have their camera right here and then those sentence stems are there. It just makes it so easy.
Yeah, and as the teacher with Flip, you can put an exemplar or an example right up there with the instructions of what it is you're asking them to do. Just today, I sent out a video showing how to use the teleprompter in Flip. So if they want to write it first, great, and dump it in the teleprompter and let them read it as they're looking at the camera and go to town. So I love all that. I'm in the midst of a thunderstorm here. I don't know if you can hear that on your end, so I'll probably be muting in and out. But strategy 3 as we move forward is creating an ongoing self-assessment routine. So developing that as a learner is really essential, but so is assessing your progress as a learner. So things like noticing the impact of the work being done. What is that doing to you as a learner? 2, noticing areas of growth or areas of stagnation or areas that you need support so that you are more likely to ask for that support. And 3, comfort in their ability to improve their skills. Those are the big things that I pulled from that ongoing self-routine. We know it's tough to find that time, but if we really want that, that ability for students to be more independent, we want that to happen, we've got to build that time into our classes and our days.
I would just say ditto to that. I feel like I was highlighting that whole section because I was like, oh, I never probably put enough time in the day for the ongoing part of self-assessment. It's like a couple units. I'd be like, how'd we do? Okay, moving on. No, the ongoing part is essential. And I love the templates they have there. And then Catlin Tucker actually just shared a video on her blog the other day in her YouTube related to this. So the timing of this chapter is perfect. And she had some more templates on there that are brand new.
Yeah, the one piece that I took away at the end of that chapter was that the idea of that ongoing routine where students are constantly going back and looking at their learning and how far they've come is the confidence that it builds in them, and seeing, oh, wow, look, I really have, made huge gains in this area. And so anytime that you can tap into that and kind of highlight that for students, I'm all about that. So that building that growth mindset and building confidence in our students, no matter how small the gains might be, pointing out to them, yes, you're growing. Yes, you're making gains. It might not feel like it in the moment, but that's just, love to see that happening for students.
Absolutely. And I think that really ties into their 4th and final strategy, which is finding a way to showcase that growth with student portfolios. I love Flipgrid, not the only thing, but Flip is awesome for this. If you're a Canvas district, there are e-portfolios that are built right in for every student that they can use throughout the years. Google Sites, solid choice. There are many others. But the idea is not just collecting it, but collecting it to have powerful opportunities for reflection over the long term, to ask all those tough questions about where was I, where am I now, where am I going? And so I think time is an issue. You got to build some time in for this as for your students in class. But what a powerful thing for students to see and be able to reflect on and to be able to share with others. We talk about, hey, let's have a student-run parent-teacher conference. Let's have a student exit interview. This is exactly the kind of thing that could lead them to really, blow the doors off of something as they leave a particular grade level, or maybe as they leave school altogether.
I took away from that the quote in there that says, think of the school year as kind of creating a documentary, And I was like, wow, that, that it kind of sparks that curiosity about themselves as a learner, and shifts the focus of like school being something that kind of happens to you or kind of around you to like building, themselves into that equation and where they become part of the story. And so telling the story of their growth throughout the year in like a documentary kind of form, I felt like this chapter or this section gave a lot of really cool examples, like a time lapse video or, a photo or just kind of like a video presentation or demonstration of like, this is how I solved this math problem at the beginning of the year, and this is how I solved it at the end of the year. Like they gave some really fun examples of how that documentary kind of feel could look. Yeah, that was fun.
I love that documentary quote as well. I started like all over. I was like, I never thought of it that way. I love it. I love it. I also liked in the last part of the chapter how they made a clear distinction between a learning portfolio and also a showcase portfolio too, and the importance of having both. And I think sometimes in my mind, I always thought of just like the showcase portfolio, whereas the learning portfolio too is really exciting to go back and see students learning and growth and really looking at the specifics and reflecting on the things they could work on and improve, but also the things that went really well. And I think that the finding time is always tricky, but this is something that really makes our students not just good at school, but just like good at life in general. You're always going to be reflecting on your learning and thinking about things that you can do different. And it's important to have goals, and this just helps motivate you. And I think it really lends itself well to the ultimate goal of UDL is making expert learners, which are very tangible things like being resourceful, knowledgeable, strategic, goal-directed, and just really thinking about those pieces. And we want our students not just to know content, but to know how to learn and how to think flexibly. And I really think this chapter connected to UDL in so many points and was really inspirational.
Great. Hey, as we reflect here on Chapter 8, a couple of questions that were provided by the book. One is consider your current assessment practices and think about how often you ask students to assess their own work. And try to build a little bit of that time in. Try to find some time for that. The second one was, how could a consistent routine of student self-assessment using the strategies outlined in the chapter help to support student self-regulation? That's kind of where we talked about earlier, and coping with frustration and challenge, which I think is super important in classrooms today. So with that, we'll say thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks for another chapter recap. And in the meantime, this session and all the sessions will be in a playlist on the Keep Indiana Learning YouTube channel. Thanks so much for joining us.